They were the heroes from the future, teenagers protecting the universe from those that would sow the seeds of chaos. Each had unique powers and abilities, and though they often had their differences, they came together to save the day as the Legion of Superheroes. Now, you can be a part of their adventures and learn the history of the future in the Legion Clubhouse.
Matthew, this week's episode of Legion Clubhouse has foes and heroes teaming together to save the galaxy. And it's going to be a good one.
This is where it all starts to change, kids.
Adventure Comics number 352, The Fatal Five. Published January 1967. Written by Jim Shooter with art by Kurt Swan from Shooter Layouts. A threat so large that the heroes cannot contain it arrives, forcing the Legion to recruit the worst villains in the galaxy.
Ladies and gentlemen, this week on the Legion Clubhouse, we present to you the introduction of 5 villains that will last for centuries.
The 5 vilest, most powerful villains in the galaxy. So terrible, so awful, that no one's ever heard of them before this very issue.
Before this very issue, no one has heard of these 5 fatal villains.
Fatal 5 villains. Shall we tell people who they are?
Yeah, let's get into this. So here's the deal. The opening pages of issue 352 is kind of a wake-up call to future Star Trek movies where there's a space station in space, and you know there's just a small crew.
Walt Disney is running the watching station.
Kind of looks like it. Yeah, he's got a frozen head, so sure, why not?
He does. That's what happens to Walt Disney's head.
When suddenly it appears on the screen, and it's so big, and it flies by the space station. It literally, when you read this, will remind you of Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home.
It reminded me of Star Trek The Motionless Picture, which has the exact same opening segment and plot of strange creature coming from beyond space.
There you go. It's a giant cloud of something. It is the Sun Eater, and it's on a direct course to our sun.
To eat it.
To eat it. And so the Legion of Superheroes have to figure out how they are going to defeat this when most of their members, including Brainiac 5, are far away. I mean, they've got a week. And no matter who they contact, every other planet is like, no, it's going to take us too long to get there. Nah, it's not going to work out. Oh, I've got a dinner date on Thursday. I need to wash my hair. You know,
it's like just High Noon. Only instead of Gary Cooper, it's Sun Boy, Cosmic Boy, Princess Projector, Pharaoh Lad, and Superboy.
So they come up with this great idea to team up with some of the greatest villains that are currently running around the solar system or the universe or the galaxy or whatever it may be, because science in this world doesn't quite make sense yet.
Well, it does, only just not. Comic book writers have no sense of scale, so they use universe and galaxy interchangeably. But yeah, they're the baddest in the galaxy. They are some bad mamma jammas.
So the first one that we get to meet is the Persuader. And the Persuader, yeah, he's super strong and he can, break through solid steel with his bare hands. But the thing that makes him amazing is his axe.
His atomic axe.
The atomic axe that can slice anything, including atoms, including gravity.
Including magnetic force, including light itself. And I gotta say, you can tell this is written by a 15-year-old boy because that is so cool.
I know, right? It's so
and completely untenable for a character. I mean, it's awesome, but then what?
Yeah, and the one thing it's not explained in this book is, and maybe it's explained years later, but it's not exactly clear how he can choose to slice magnetic force and how he chooses to slice gravity. Because it would seem like if an axe can slice gravity, every time he swings it, it would slice gravity. But that's not quite how this atomic axe works.
Well, no. And here's the thing about the axe. Later, it is revealed that the axe itself is actually an antique.
Right.
It is left over from a previous war, and it is one of those things that is kind of just an ancient relic that might as well be magic, because it cannot just cut through. It can cut through metaphors. Basically, it is so incredibly powerful. It's one of a kind, and it's just this really awesome thing. And something else that's very important about the Persuader is, much like Karate Kid,
Yeah.
he is very much coded as an Asian character.
Yeah, which is really interesting because I don't know if it is in this issue or in stuff that we're going to be talking about next week. But in one of the letters to the editor segment, it says on page 14 in your July issue, you introduce a strange evil face, which is obviously that of an Oriental person. Now I'm reading this, directly from the page.
Sure.
So, take this as a time period kind of conversation.
A grain of salt, 1967 is what we're looking at.
It would appear that you're trying to instill prejudices in impressionable young people. One can hardly help noticing that most of your heroes are white Anglo-Saxon looking, and those that are not are difficult to associate with any human race on Earth. This comes from Ronald from Minnesota. And the editor's reply is, well, we never intended to make this villain look Oriental. In fact, and here comes some bad stuff, in fact, we changed his appearance in the next issue. You might say that the Oriental was purely Occidental. Smack your head. As we'll reveal in a future issue, one of our newest Legionnaires, Karate Kid, learned his stuff from an Oriental. Oh, man. 1967, folks. Remember, we just had a test of your bro quotient not too long ago, and we got this going on.
This is a test of your racial sensitivity for 60-year-old stories. But the Persuader's real name is not revealed in this issue, but his real name, this Persuader's real name is Nguyen Chen Ti.
Right.
He is, in fact,
like Korean,
either Chinese or a Chinese. I want to say Chinese. I can't remember. Does that the last name Chen Ti? I don't know.
Nguyen for me. I mean, it's not Nguyen. It's not straight up Korean there, but yeah.
It's kind of a nonsense.
I wonder if what's going on in 1967, why you might want to have someone who has a vaguely Asian look to himself be considered a villain.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Now that's a thing.
Now let's talk about this for a little bit because, for years, and even in the reboots, the Persuader and the Atomic Axe are back, but it's not always this particular character, correct?
Correct. There are a lot of Persuaders. I think there are 4 or 5 Persuaders by this point. But the thing about the Persuader, much like many of the Legion villains, is that he's such a cool visual that nobody really knows what his deal is.
Yeah.
So I think I want to say there are a couple of modern day Persuaders, because there was one in Action Comics. And then there was a teenage female Persuader who was part of the Terror Titans right about the time of Final Crisis, around 2005, 2006.
And don't forget, in the 8th season of Smallville, the Persuader appeared in that as well.
Yeah, he was also part of the Legion of Superheroes cartoon briefly, which I thought was actually kind of nice.
Now, he's not typically considered the leader of the Fatal Five.
No, and the weird thing about the Fatal Five is they have kind of an argumentative thing, because they have 3 people who kind of want to lead and 2 guys who are kind of the big dumb muscle. But even the big dumb muscle guys are atypical, because he's one of the big dumb muscle guys, but he's also really conniving and, really kind of a backstabber, not just the okay, whatever you say kind of guy.
Right. This is probably a reason why villains really don't get along well.
Yes, and we'll actually see that throughout the next couple of issues. It's very important that you remember that foreshadowing is your key to quality literature.
We also were introduced to Mono, or Mano.
Mono. His friends call him the Hand of Fate.
Yes.
He comes from the planet Ang-2, which he destroyed.
Yes, it's a polluted planet, but somehow he was born with this mutated hand that has the ability to obliterate anything. Keep that in mind. That's literally how it's described in this book. He has the power to obliterate anything.
Yep.
And so he got so angry at all the people for ostracizing him on his planet that he simply touched the planet and blew it up, just destroyed
it to smithereens. And something else that's interesting about Mono is, if you look at Mono's name, it kind of implies that Angtu is somehow descended from Spanish-speaking people.
Right. That's what I would think too, because it's a manos, right? It would be hand.
Mano is the Spanish word for hand. Yes,
Right.
manos is hands.
Right. So
hands, the hands of fate, if you will.
Yeah. So it's really interesting that that would be that way. It would be weird that so this is really an issue that talks about prejudice and also brings a lot of it into it, because he comes from a very dirty, polluted planet.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're saying maybe it was the pollution that created this apparition, this strange person who could just destroy anything with his touch.
Incredibly powerful.
Yeah, it's really incredibly powerful. You'd think that he'd be able to touch a Sun Eater and just obliterate it. I mean, if he can destroy a planet,
Sun Eater's more powerful than a planet.
Well, maybe. We'll find out. We are also introduced to Tharok, or however you want to say it.
I prefer to call him Dwayne Tharok Johnson.
Yes.
But I think it's Tharok.
Yeah, Tharok is... Man, this guy made a bad mistake. He was trying to impress some mob bosses, so he stole a nuclear device, and the police shot at him, and it blew up the nuclear device and literally obliterated half of his body.
Okay. I just want to point out that the sound effect for having half of your body eliminated is spelled E-E-Y-A-H-H-O, which I believe... That's
the Goofy cry.
It's pronounced... Yes.
Yeah, it's the Goofy
exactly
fall.
What it is.
Yeah.
And the people of his planet, the Zadronians,
yes,
are so advanced and so incredibly caring and so charismatically thoughtful, or whatever the word is that
they don't like to kill.
Right. They don't want to kill. So even though this person is a terrible, terrible, horrible thing, they quickly, immediately cobbled together a robot half. So Tharok's left half of his body is entirely synthetic.
So he has a mixture of robot brain and human brain. But the robot half had to be fashioned quickly and is so crude and ugly, but at least he's alive.
Yeah. And once again, we see that in comic books in the 60s and well into the 80s, ugly equals evil.
Yeah, which is really kind of crazy.
It is.
He's kind of the brains of the group. He would be kind of like your Brainiac 5 of this group. You also have a controller. I say controller. You have the Emerald Empress of Vengar, who gets her power and has the power to control the Emerald Eye of Ekron, which came from, that we'll find out years later, the Emerald Head of Ekron.
Well, Lobo said, I suppose, the Emerald Head of Ekron. But yeah.
I mean, that's what it is. I mean, they literally have a head floating out in space that they go and they find the eye in. This would have been in the pages of 52, I believe.
Yes, and it's fascinating to look at the Emerald Eye, because in practice, the Emerald Eye is essentially the same as an Owen Green Lantern ring.
Yes, very much so, which I find very fascinating, because there's a thing that's going to come up in the next installment, next episode of the Legion Clubhouse, that we probably ought to talk about where the Owens are at this point, because at this point we have kind of mentioned before that the Green Lantern Corps is kind of absent in this sector of space.
Yep, they're not allowed on Earth now.
I've always liked the Emerald Empress. She's always been one of my favorite villains, especially when it comes up to the Legion of Superheroes, because she's evil and she's sexy and she kind of is somewhat petty. And I think the pettiness of a villain is really kind of cool, right? Because her whole thing is, ooh, I got the hots for Superman. I'm going to see if I can't use this piece of kryptonite that I have on my belt to control him and make him my manslave.
Yeah, Saria, the Emerald Empress, is remarkably overtly sexy for 1967.
Which is odd, because her costume is the total opposite, at least in this incarnation, is total opposite of sexy, because she's wearing, imagine you're wearing a bathing suit over a loose-fitting leotard, and then on top of that, you're going to put a bustier on top of that, and then you're going to top it off with some baggy thigh-length boots and a cape.
If you imagine that the white portions of her costume, as they are in later incarnations, are actually transparent or not even there,
right?
This is a costume that could easily pass for 1967 values of highly charged erotica.
It could be, except that we've seen Dream Girl and we've seen Princess Projectra, who wear a lot less clothing than
That's
the Emerald
true.
Empress does.
Well, they're good. I mean, evil girls dress up
Oh,
like
the evil girls dress up. They try to cover up as much of their body as they possibly can. The
right,
heroes are
right.
the ones that have to show as much skin to be taken seriously. I see.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the
So,
final
well,
fatal.
let's. Is there anything else that we need to know about Thayrock or the Emerald Empress before we get into one of the most fascinating discussions we're going to have? Well, maybe the
Oh.
second most fascinating discussion we're going to have this episode.
Let's see. The Emerald Eye is super powerful. At this point, it does not seem to have a consciousness of itself.
It does get one later, and
It
doesn't it?
will.
Isn't it revealed later that it's really the eye controlling the person? Because at one point,
Mm-hmm.
Shrinking Violet gets a hold of the Emerald Eye of Ekron, and she becomes not the Emerald Eye, but
Emerald Vi.
Emerald Vi.
I hate that joke. It's even worse when she gets growing powers and becomes Leviathan. But
Right.
the Emerald Eye, yes, in later incarnations, and in fact, later on in this incarnation, Saria herself, at a point, oh gosh, probably 20 years down the line now at this point, will be discovered to be possessed by, or at least heavily swayed by, the Eye. And the reboot version of the Emerald Eye is just flat out malicious and evil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Whereas this version of the Emerald Eye is just more of a kind of a greedy, amoral creature.
Which really it doesn't even come off, at least in this first appearance, as something that's sentient. It's more of a device. She comes off dressed as very much a witch that you might have of a medieval fantasy role-playing campaign. In fact, when Superboy encounters her, she is on a planet where she's being burned to the stake because they think that she is a witch. And, of course, it's a medieval England-type planet. So
well, she weighs more than a duck.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
So, this idea that she has this orb that you can use to shoot your opponents with is very RPG centric. I mean, obviously you don't have that at this time period. You're about 6 or 7 years away from that. But
it's a level 27 magic item.
Yeah, but it's still interesting to see that there. So yeah, it's going to be real interesting to see how she evolves over time in this series.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's talk about one of the most fascinating and maybe saddest villains of the Fatal Five.
Yeah, very much a tragedy is the story of Validus.
Okay, so in this installment, Validus is this giant. I mean, he's like well over 7 feet tall, Matthew.
Oh, he's massive. Validus actually gets bigger and bigger to the point where he's eventually like 20 feet tall.
Yeah, he's super huge. I mean, at this point,
enormous.
He's at least 15 feet tall.
Yes, and his strength is incredible. His brain is non-functional, but he always has mental lightning bolts. Mental lightning.
Yeah, so
flashing around his dome.
It's interesting because if we're looking at the Emerald Empress as your witch character or your sorceress character, Validus is your psionic character. Yeah. Because not only does he want to control your mind, but he's also trying to zap it with these electric lightning bolts from his brain. And he can't see anything. I mean, it's basically if you picture a brain inside of a jar attached to the top of your head.
With a screaming
voice. And you're super, super strong. Now, at this point in this story, all we know is that he's this out-of-control rage monster that no one knows what to do with. All of these characters, or at least, let's see, Mano and Validus and
Thayrock.
Not Thayrock. He's not on the chopping block, but certainly the Emerald Empress is. They're all basically slated for death if they don't sign up to help defeat the Sun Eater. So what's really fascinating is they figured out a way to control Validus, but we never really learn his backstory until much, 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 much later. And ladies and gentlemen, we may have already indicated it to you, but Validus has lightning bolts coming out of his brain.
Yes. It is not until 1984 that we learn that Validus is, in fact, the firstborn son of Garth Rand's Lightning Lad and Imra Ardeen's Saturn Girl. Garridan Rands is actually captured and sent back in time by a wicked evil villain, Darkseid.
By the name of Darkseid.
Yep, and is literally sent back in time as an unknown quantity to torture and fight his own parents for decades before he's even born. That is hardcore,
That is
my friend.
it is really crazy, but it makes sense, right?
Yeah, and it's madness. It's when they reveal it, how well it all kind of spins together.
And
And
makes perfect sense in hindsight.
yeah, and apparently the whole mental lightning thing, even this far back, had APA fans and Legion, fanfic writers hypothesizing about his origins. And I believe that his origin as the son of Saturn Girl and Lightning Lad actually came partly from hypotheticals put together by Legion fans and the Legion APAs and pen pal groups.
Well, it's going to be really interesting, and this is maybe the problem that I have in how these stories are presented.
Mm-hmm.
I really think that this story, if I were telling them, I would actually tell the 2 issues that we're going to look at in the next episode of the Legion Clubhouse before this one.
I would have
for
too,
a couple of
actually.
reasons. For a couple of reasons. Number one, and we'll talk about this in the next episode, there's actually a scene where they're talking about Saturn Girl and Lightning Lad getting married. There's also this tribute to heroes that have fallen, and of course, there is a certain character that dies in this week's episode that it mentions. Away. And then it'd be really fascinating to say, oh, here is this. And then you jump back and you get into the Sun Eater thing and you're like, oh, I was paying attention to that one panel in that one small script. I know what's going to happen next. Because really, the death of this one character in this week's episode is kind of anticlimactic.
Yeah. It is. And it's a difficult thing to kind of process because not only is there not really any setup for it or any of the traditional, Marvel Comics, oh my God, foreshadowing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to give it away, but I'm just going to say that this person has not made a lot of appearances.
No. So have we talked about the Fatal Five? Is there anything else that we want to talk about Validus? I mean, it's super tragic origin story.
Well, one thing that this issue and the next issue revealed to me that I found really shocking. Validus in these issues speaks.
Right.
And in later stories, we are told explicitly that Validus cannot and does not speak. So I have actually I have done a little bit of digging on this, and I cannot for the life of me find out any explanation for why Validus is able to speak in Adventure Comics 352 and 353 and 354.
Well, and I think part of it may have to do with the fact that while Validus is evil, he's also being controlled, right? So Tharok, I'm going to just call him Tharok. Tharok figures out a way to control Validus. And so part of it may be
manipulating him, basically.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. I mean, but he literally has a control over him. And so part of that could be, that may be why he can't speak, because he's being controlled by someone else who doesn't want him to speak in retaliation for not killing Princess Projectra when he was commanded to. So in the second part of this issue, they're all going up against the Sun Eater. That's the whole point of this, is to try to destroy the Sun Eater. And at one point, Princess Projectra is about to be killed, and Validus steps in and saves her. Doesn't have to, but just does it.
Yep. And it's another example.
What would have been even more amazing is if they hadn't have had Princess Projectra in here, but had it been Saturn Girl.
And, in retrospect, it might have been cooler, but I like the fact that it's Projectra, because she and Pharaoh Lad and Karate Kid really haven't done much since they joined the team.
No, they really haven't. And I think, well, is there anything else in this first kind of issue that we want? So the Legion go out. There's only five or six of them. They go out and they go and track down each of these villains. The writing here is not super great, especially when it comes to Pharaoh Lad's kind of lines. I mean, he really has some dopey lines in this issue, which is really sad. But
they kind of establish him as a heroic but not particularly bright young man.
Ooh, that's also troubling, as we'll get to here in just a little bit. But this whole first issue is all set up. I mean, the Legion are sitting in their clubhouse watching a film strip on who the Fatal Five are individually.
Right.
And then they have to go out and they know the Sun Eater is coming. So then they have to go out and find these villains and convince them that if they can all team up together, then that we can defeat the Sun Eater together. And they're all on a ship and they're all trying to fly back. And of course, everybody has their own little plans and schemes. Mano just wants to break into Emerald Empress's room without knocking. And you see her laying on her bed looking at pictures of Superman, Superboy. And it's just like, oh, Superboy's so dreamy. And then, of course, you see Tharok basically taking control. I am the smartest, you fools. And the way he's written really feels like not a Brainiac of the Superman villains, but he does sound an awful lot like and feel an awful lot like Metallo, which is really weird. And I don't know why it comes off that way. And maybe it's just because I can hear what's-his-name's voice every time Tharok speaks.
See, I always hear an evil Brainiac 5.
Okay.
I hear him as an evil counterpart to Brainiac. And this issue, explains that the other 20 Legionnaires are on a special mission in another dimension, including Brainiac.
Yeah, BK51 or something.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's BR549. But I really like the introduction and the use of Tharok as kind of a counterpoint, a Brainiac 5-like voice in the story.
Right.
That is also clearly evil and up to something.
Yes. And in fact, Tharok does think that I'll find out what everybody's powers and weaknesses are. And then we as villains can team up and we can kill them and we can take over the galaxy. And that's kind of the big reveal later on is that, oh yeah, we're gonna destroy the Sun Eater. We're gonna do it. And then we're gonna kill you, Legion, and then we're gonna take over the galaxy because that's how we work. We are the Fatal Five. And then they all high five, and then we freeze frame and say, and the caption says, "Will the Fatal Five take over the galaxy? Find out in next month's issue."
Same Legion time, same Legion channel.
Adventure Comics number 353, The Doomed Legionnaire. Published February 1967. Written by Jim Shooter with art by Kurt Swan from Shooter Layouts. With the Sun Eater on its way, one Legionnaire prepares to make the ultimate sacrifice.
So we get to the point in the story where Tharok's plan all comes together, and the Persuader is going to chop the Sun Eater up into, 5 easy pieces or 8 easy pieces that everyone can then take on with their individual strengths and weaknesses and destroy them one by one. But the Sun Eater's just too powerful, Matthew.
Even for your super magic axe from World War V, 6, I don't remember. I'm going to say World War 6.
Okay. Because the World War 7 is actually mentioned in an upcoming issue, which I found also
I want
very
to
weird.
say the Persuader's axe is a leftover relic from World War 6.
Okay, but it's not an Atomic Knight's axe, is it?
No, it is an atomic axe from our future, but the Legion's past.
Okay.
Whereas the Atomic Knights take place in 1967's future, but our past.
Aha.
The far-flung world of 1984.
So, Matthew, the Sun Eater is on a direct course to our sun. How are you going to divert it from our sun?
You, my friend, are going to call upon one of the longest-serving Legionnaires to do the most heroic thing I think he has done in the history of the Legion to date. You are going to have Sun Boys stand on a platform in space, not a flying platform like they had a couple of episodes ago, but just a platform in space and just be a sun.
Yeah. I mean, it works, right? I mean, it does bring him over there, and then Persuader's able to chop it up. But one by one, as we already mentioned, Princess Projectra is not able to do anything about it. Superboy is not able to do it because apparently the Sun Eater is like, oh, I see. You get your powers from the yellow sun. I will shoot red sun rays out at you because that's how I work.
Which is kind of brilliant, actually, on the part of the Sun Eater.
Emerald Empress can't do anything. She's taken down.
Nope.
And Mano, which, again, a guy who can destroy anything with a single touch, is not able to dissipate the Sun Eater.
It knows his weakness, and his weakness is he only has the one hand.
That's it. One hand.
One hand. It can destroy things, but he only has one hand. Now, granted, last issue did set him up as able to destroy a planet with a single touch.
Mm-hmm.
But the only thing we can figure is that the Sun Eater is more powerful than a planet.
We were talking a little bit ago about the problem of scale. So the Sun Eater is literally able to eat a sun like it is eating like a everlasting gobstopper, right?
Right.
It just is like, or an orange or something like that. It may take a few bites, but the sun is gone. So the Sun Eater should be much, much bigger than our sun.
And even the 5 segments of it should be massive.
Yes.
I mean, if you cut something that could swallow the sun into 5 pieces, you're still going to have something larger than planet Earth.
Yeah. Which is, again, kind of weird.
Science fiction. It happens.
Yeah. Pharaoh Lad is able to actually, because he's encased in his iron suit, is actually able to go into the center of one portion of the Sun Eater and find its little nucleus.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, oh, that's what's controlling everything. If I can destroy that, we can win the day.
Yep.
But
and by the way, it's not a metal suit. That's his metal skin.
Oh, that's his metal skin. That's right.
He turns to steel like Colossus.
That's not problematic at all. Actually, let's talk about the problem of Pharaoh Lad real quick.
Okay.
So, I know Matthew knows, but I'm rhetorically asking, do you know what the problem is with Pharaoh Lad and his origin?
I think that the problem with Pharaoh Lad has to stem from the elephant in the room that we have not been talking about in the issues where Pharaoh Lad appears.
Is because he never takes off his mask so we can never see his face?
He's the only Legionnaire to even wear a mask. None of the other Legionnaires have masks as part of their uniform. Yeah. The closest you have is Invisible Kid's cool disco headband.
Yeah. Hey, I got another question, Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
You remember a little bit ago we were talking about that letter that was sent in from the editor saying, hey, how come you're always making these bad guys Asians?
Mm-hmm.
I got a question for you, Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
How come we've never seen any black people in the Legion of Superheroes?
Well, there is an in-universe explanation.
Yes. I know, it's
and
really
an out-of-universe explanation. The in-universe explanation is incredibly cringeworthy, but goes like this. All of the African Americans moved to an island which warps out of Earth's dimension every few years, and they don't come back till 1974.
Interesting.
Or 1974 our time, 2074 Legion time.
Or maybe 1966 Legion time, because Pharaoh Lad was supposed to be introduced as a black character, and that's why he was wearing the mask throughout his initial appearances, and he never took it off. There was at one point, and I forget if it was a Jack Kirby story or what the story was, but it's talking about this astronaut who goes out into space, and then when he comes back, and you're like really feeling for this astronaut, he's been wearing this helmet the entire time, and when he comes back down and he lands, you realize that he is a black man, and at that point you're supposed to go, oh my gosh, how prejudiced am I because of all these other things that are going on into the story, and I put this on this character.
And the story that he inhabits, it's actually an EC comic story from the 50s called Judgment Day.
Judgment Day, that's right.
And Judgment Day is the story of an alien race of purple people and green people who are fighting each other because of the color of their skin.
Mm-hmm.
And it is very much, it's as subtle a metaphor as the episode of Star Trek with Beale and Lokai, who hate each other because they're half black, half white, but on different sides of their body.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end, what puts it over the top and what turns it from, just a standard story into probably the most memorable of EC's preachies in, I want to say, weird fantasy, circa like 1953. The story ends with, the whole thing, prejudice is bad, people think, and throughout the story, the implication is that readers are going to assume this is our standard square-jawed Leslie Nielsen Caucasian hero.
Right.
He takes off
because his helmet is on the entire time.
And he takes off his helmet in the final panel, and we see that he is African-American.
Right. And that was a Jack Kirby story, correct? If I'm not mistaken, or at least the art? Or am I thinking of somebody else altogether?
You are thinking of something else altogether. This one is drawn by Joe Orlando.
Okay.
And I'm almost certain it was Bill Gaines or Al Feldstein who wrote it.
Well, it was certainly Gaines that would have written it. because he was very much in favor of moving forward with progressive thought at that time period.
Well, and Gaines was the guy behind DC Comics.
Yep.
Gaines
Yep.
was the dude. So if he either wrote it or co-wrote it, but they were actually told when they tried to print it that the story violated the comics code.
I know, right?
And
Crazy.
they would have to make the astronaut Caucasian.
Which is weird because the book is printed in, at the time, I believe, in black and white. And he still has features that easily distinguish him.
The initial printing was in color. And I believe the way that the story has been told, at least from the EC side of things, is the Comics Code Authority said no. And Feldstein and Gaines said, fine, if you punt on this story, we're going to go public with the reasons why you're objecting to it.
Yeah.
And you're objecting because the main character is African American. And the Comics Code Authority backed down.
And that brings us back around to Pharaoh Lad.
Mm-hmm.
In the story, as is told by Jim Shooter, when Jim Shooter first created the character, he intended Pharaoh Lad to be black. But Mort Weisinger said no because, quote, we'll lose our distribution in the South.
Right.
And again, you got to think what's going on right now in the
1967.
South with civil rights movements, with voter registrations, with everything. It's just a hotbed of racism in the South. And if you suddenly have a hero come out who is black, you could see a lot of stores suddenly saying, no, we don't want to carry this book.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's just a year later that Night of the Living Dead comes out with an African-American protagonist, and it would not air. They would not play it in certain Southern areas because it had a black protagonist, a black hero. So this is one of the stories that, and I say apocryphally because I can't prove it one way or the other, but apocryphally is put together to kind of support a narrative that Mort Weisinger was himself a little bit prejudiced. Now, I can't say whether or not that's true, and I certainly don't disagree with anyone who says that it's not because I never met the man, but there are a number of times when you look at these early Legion stories and you say, there are literally no people of color in the stories.
Right.
And this is not the only time a Legion character starts out with the intent, the creative intent of being African American and getting punted and saying, no, you can't do that. This happens actually a couple of times. There's a character called Soldier that we'll see just a few years down the line in the Mike Grell era of the Legion where something very similar happens with a very similar editorial team. And so it does really raise an unpleasant question. But then again, Shooter's response isn't exactly all that much better.
Yeah, so here's what happens. The Legion and the Fatal Five are not able to stop the Sun Eater, but Tharok is like, oh, I've analyzed all your fighting tactics and I've realized how we can defeat the Sun Eater once and for all. I've built this bomb that if we can get it to the heart of the Sun Eater and ignite it and detonate it, it will destroy the Sun Eater for good. And before anyone else has a chance to say, I'll do it, and get in a big fight over that, Pharaoh Lad grabs the bomb, rockets out of the spaceship, flies directly into the heart of the beast, and explodes himself and the Sun Eater at the same time. Gone.
And Superboy had intended to do it. Superboy was literally reaching for the bomb and preparing to do this, but because Superboy had been weakened by the green kryptonite in his encounter with the Emerald Empress last issue, he slowed down just enough for Pharaoh Lad to get the drop on him. Pharaoh Lad cold cocks him to save the universe, and Pharaoh Lad realizes, of course, that if Superboy dies, it creates a huge, massive plot twist, and the universe collapses in and on itself.
So this again, Jim Shooter wanted Pharaoh Lad to be black. Weisinger said no, and so that is why Shooter chose Pharaoh Lad to be the one to die in this story. He says, "quote Pharaoh Lad, I killed because my plan was that he was a black guy," and Mort said no. Then I said, "Well, let's see. I've got this idea for a story, and someone needs to die. Aha! I'll pick Pharaoh Lad. Basically, I killed him off because it annoyed me that I couldn't do with him what I wanted." So he killed Pharaoh Lad out of spite, but in hindsight, knowing that he should have been black kind of makes it a little bit weird.
It does. Well, it really comes across to me as a young creator making a rash decision because of what he perceived to be and what I think clearly was editorial meddling.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also the question you have to ask yourself of, had they introduced Pharaoh Lad, had him wear his mask for X number of issues and then pull
Right.
off his mask and go, aha, I'm actually black. Is that any less offensive or any less insensitive? Because this is supposed to be the forward-thinking 30th century.
Mm-hmm.
We've already seen some of those early, big, strong feminist moments being rolled back for the Legion of Women. I just don't know.
He probably would have been killed.
Yeah.
If he had pulled off the helmet and you would have seen non-white underneath the helmet, I really have a feeling he would have been killed because editorial would have said, "Oh no, we can't have this."
Right. We'd lose our distribution in the South. But
it's really weird that Tyrock, who comes out in 1976, 75, 76. Okay. It's interesting. He becomes, the black member of the Legion of Superheroes. But even during the reboots, there are opportunities where they could have changed that with Pharaoh Lad, and they opted not to.
Yeah, and I think that is a missed opportunity. I think it's a missed opportunity in that reboot Pharaoh is an entirely different character. I mean,
right.
Reboot
you
Pharaoh
did it with
might
Princess
as well
Projectra and turned her from a sexy lady in a cape to a snake lady.
Sexy snake in a cape, yeah.
Yeah.
That's the thing. I don't know that Jim Shooter story about his intentions was public knowledge in 1994. So
probably not.
You can give them a pass there. And of course, by 2005, when they revamped it into the WKRP Legion, Pharaoh Lad wasn't even part of that iteration of the Legion.
So, Matthew, the weird thing is, this is not the last time that we see this Sun Eater story.
No, it's not even the last time we see Pharaoh Lad intending to try and destroy that Sun Eater.
There is a DC event. It's either called Darkest Night or Blackest Night. And I want to say it's Darkest Night, but a Sun Eater does get...
Night.
Oh, Final Night. That's what it is. Final Night. There's too much black and dark and final in the DC universe. But Final Night happens. A Sun Eater gets through, and it is chowing down on the sun, and the sun is about to go out, and all the heroes are just trying to figure out, how can we save the Earth? How can we save all these people? How can we defeat the Sun Eater? There's a great story where Fire is trying to save her town in South America by just burning all of her fuel, trying to keep the town warm while it's going out. Mm-hmm. And in that story, we do have this version or a version of Pharaoh Lad. Which version is this? The reboot version of Pharaoh Lad?
The reboot Pharaoh Lad. Pharaoh is his name, and he's actually from the 20th century in the reboot.
Yeah.
And at one point, he tells Brainiac 5, I have a plan, and he hands him a handheld drawing that looks almost exactly like Swan's drawing of the original Pharaoh Lad flying in with the bomb. But Brainiac 5 tells him it's the stupidest thing he's ever heard of, and Earth is actually saved by Hal Jordan.
Who is at this point Parallax, the crazed guy who's gone out and killed all the Green Lanterns and tried to resurrect Coast City by turning them all into light projections.
Yep. Using the absorbed power of the Owen Central Power Battery, Hal reignites our sun, which is better than the idea that the Demon had. The Demon was going to promise people heat at the cost of their souls, and what he was going to do was he was just going to stick the whole planet in HE double hockey sticks.
Yeah.
And
of course, then Hal Jordan dies, becomes the Spectre, and then later is resurrected, thanks to Jeff Johns.
Well, that's an entirely different story. That's got nothing. You can't have Green Lanterns in the Legion in 1967.
But the point is, we get this story told again in another time. Pharaoh Lad doesn't die, but it is interesting that they're trying to make these parallels, and it's really crazy, man.
It really is, and it's really wonderful to read this story, having read that one not so long ago, because I remember reading that one and thinking, oh, ha, they're making fun of the silliness, but these two issues are played dead serious.
Mm-hmm.
And even the parts of it that are goofy in retrospect aren't overtly goofy and aren't so weird that you're like, oh, ha, look how stupid it is that he has the bomb. It's played entirely straightforward as drama, and it really works. I feel like it works for me as a reader to see Pharaoh Lad flying in with the bomb to the core of the Sun Eater.
Oh, yeah, no, it's great. It is awesome. It's like, here's what being a hero means. Sometimes you jump on the bomb, sometimes you deliver the bomb, and sometimes you let a Pharaoh Lad punch you in the chin so you don't have to do it.
Now, we cannot prove that
this point-
Kal-El took a dive.
Here's the thing. This is a time period where Superman and Superboy are OP. There is a moment where Superboy throws his cape over Validus's head to try to figure out if that will blind him and keep the electric rays from shooting out of his helmet, because his cape
Spoilers,
is so powerful.
Doesn't work.
Because his cape is so powerful. This is a character who, in this era right now, will fly into the sun to wash his cape.
True. But extensive exposure to both kryptonite and red sun radiation, I think, makes a strong enough case that Superboy is depowered enough that Pharaoh Lad was able to get the drop on him.
It is the only explanation. And you know, in Shooter's defense here, he played that out perfectly to make sure that their most powerful character is out of the picture, because everyone else is over in a different dimension.
Right.
That story we'll never know.
Well, it's an untold tale of the Legion.
I've got a question about that. It doesn't happen here, but it will happen next issue.
We'll get to that.
So now that the Sun Eater is defeated, it is time for the Fatal Five to turn on the Legion and take over the galaxy, right?
They're certainly going to try. Tharok is willing to slap Cosmic Boy right in his stupid face. And then, of course, the Emerald Empress is like, nya ha ha ha. But you recall the story of Beauty and the Beast.
Oh, 'twas Beauty that killed the Beast.
So in this case, the part of Linda Hamilton will be played by Projectra of Orlando, who, remembering Validus's kindness and his risking her life earlier in the story, actually calls on Validus and says, Validus, you risk your life to save mine. Can you truly kill me now? And Validus says, no, I can't. And fights the Persuader, turns on his friends. He and the Persuader disintegrate the Fatal Five in a blast of pure logic.
Which is really weird. And they're like, oh, are they dead? Who can say? Could even that terrible onslaught have destroyed Validus? Or could it have burst a dimensional barrier that sent them into some limbo?
Limbo. You know what I think happened? Projectra's cousin, DSX Machina.
Zapped them into the Phantom Zone?
Exactly. And if you look, the Emerald Empress is gesturing in that last panel that the five disappears.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if the Emerald Empress might not have popped them away. But that's a story for a later time, because right now it's time for our 1, 2, 3, 4. If you count, 3 1/3. I'm going to say 3 1/3 Legion funeral.
Which is, again, Pharaoh Lad, we hardly knew ye, right? I mean, the character has not been in the comic that often.
He's appeared 5 times since his first appearance in 347. And at least 2 of those were just, hey, I sure am here as part of the group, yuck.
Yeah.
Last episode, I believe we had an important armor-piercing question from him that helped to unravel the plot. And, of course, he's pretty heavily featured in 353 and 352. But
man, his send-off, literally, to the Shangri-La planet.
Shanghala. They load his remains into an oxygen container.
And then they pop the bottom and it goes rocketing off into space.
Off into space.
But here's the thing. Brainiac 5 says, even with my computer brain, we were not able to gather the scattered particles that were Pharaoh Lad. But they did that with the Duo Damsel when her triple was murdered.
Mm-hmm.
They sucked all of her parts back together and shot them off to Shangri-La.
This is the thing. She was burned to death by a giant erector set. He was Napoleon blown apart.
There you go. Well, I guess I can see that. But he gets literally, his send-off is 2 panels in this book. And it's like, hey, every person on Earth should be coming out to pay their respects because this guy took down the Sun Eater.
Yeah. And I believe we learn his name in this issue.
Yes.
I can't remember if we knew that his name was Andrew Nolan before
I
now.
don't think we did, but it does say in memoriam of Andrew Nolan, in parentheses, Pharaoh Lad.
For those,
A mutant, Matthew,
Mm-hmm.
whose non-human face was kept hidden behind a mask. He gave his life to save this galaxy.
Hopefully Shanghala is in the same galaxy as Earth, so that we won't have.
Imagine.
We don't want to end up mired in a syntax conflict. So
yeah, but no, I mean, it's really cool. I mean, we see the use of the word mutant, and this is not the first time the word mutant has popped up in a Legion of Superheroes book.
No, and the best part about it is the second half of the page with the death of Pharaoh Lad and his remains being sent off into space is a big Christmas thing.
Yes,
about how to be careful when roasting marshmallows on the open fire, which shows you right there that DC knows its audience. Here's Pharaoh Lad's corpse just in time
Watch
for Christmas.
Those sparks. It's a sure way of getting a hot foot or worse.
Yep.
Oh, yeah, I saw that and I was just like, poor choice there. Too soon, DC.
Bad placement on the player. I'm going to blame that one on Weisinger and not Boltinoff. But yeah, it's a fascinating end, and it really is a moment that it feels so sudden and it feels so awkward that it kind of does add credence to Jim Shooter's story, And again, I can't prove whether it is or isn't true, but it's one of those stories that sounds really great after the fact, almost too good.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels like it's so out of left field and so bizarre and awkward that, yeah, I can kind of see in this story and the way these 6 issues with Pharaoh Lad came together, maybe maybe there's something behind it. Maybe Shooter is remembering things the way that he did them because, man, it feels weirdly anticlimactic. But in retrospect and in hindsight, as we go on, this Legion death is going to be one of the ones that becomes emblematic. This is the big, this is even before Barry Allen, Ultimate Sacrifice, trademark and copyright.
Mm-hmm. Yep. The other weird thing about this issue, beyond the death of Pharaoh Lad, which we've spent a lot of time, is why we have goody-goody heroes and batty-batty villains teaming up in this adventure when, man, there are a number of different ways they could have done this exact same story without involving the villains.
But that, my friend, takes us back around. You remember when we had that long discussion about Fantastic Voyage?
Mm-hmm.
And the movie influences on that.
Right.
According to Jim Shooter's recollections of this story, he was told by Weisinger, the editor, he was told, hey, can you give me one of them Dirty Dozen stories? Because that Dirty Dozen movie was pretty awesome. This movie came out in the spring of 1967, like June 1967.
Right.
And it's the story. It's a World War II Army story of the Dirty Dozen, a group of criminals and malcontents and I don't know. Let's call them Ernest Borgnines.
Yeah, you got an Ernest Borgnine in there.
Sure, you got an Ernest Borgnine, you got a Lee Marvin, you got a Charles Bronson.
You also have a Jim Brown.
You got a John Cassavetes. You got all of these characters brought together, and they have a mission. And some of them are evil, some of them are kind of okay, but they have to come together to respond and take care of an evil German plot circa World War II. And that is what this story is. This is Shooter doing the Dirty Dozen in space. So the heroes are out of commission. There's a desperate thing. You have a few heroes left, and they have to bring the worst villains in the galaxy together, and they all have to coexist to take out a greater threat, which is not, in this case, Nazi Germany, but in fact an evil thing from beyond Earth space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Real quick, do you remember how Jim Brown's character died in the Dirty Dozen?
Did he carry a live bomb into the heart of the Sun Eater?
He is one that throws live grenades down the shafts where the Nazis are holed up. So yes, he does deliver a bomb, and yes, he does die in the Dirty Dozen.
Holy crap. That's kind of amazing. I hadn't really made that connection. And, if Shooter is saying that he meant Pharaoh Lad to be an African-American character.
Yeah, really interesting. Something to think about. I'm curious what our listeners think about that little revelation. Podcast at Majorspoilers.com. Matthew, what did we learn this week?
Well, we learned that Uncle Walt is alive and well in the 30th century, and he's watching for sun eaters, so sleep well.
I think we also learned that movies draw inspiration from comics, and comics draw inspirations from movies.
Also, we learned that the worst villains in the galaxy are people you haven't heard of yet, so it's no sense being mad at the people you already know.
That wraps it up for this installment of the Legion Clubhouse. Thank you so much for being a part of our adventures and our discussions. We love hearing from you. You can drop us emails at podcast@majorspoilers.com, or better yet, head over to majorspoilers.com and share your thoughts in the comments section for this episode. Also, if you enjoy our discussions, we could use your support. Head over to patreon.com/majorspoilers to find out more. That wraps it up for this episode of the Legion Clubhouse. And until next time, I'm Douglas Nolan.
And I'm Framadus.
The Legion Clubhouse is a production of Major Spoilers Entertainment, LLC, and is produced by Steven Schleicher. Your hosts were Matthew Peterson and Steven Schleicher. You can follow Matthew at Mighty King Cobra and Steven at Major Spoilers. You can follow this podcast on Twitter at Legion Clubhouse. If you have questions or comments, send them to podcast@majorspoilers.com. I'm Jason Inman. Until next time, eat it, Grandpa.
This podcast is copyright 2018 by Major Spoilers Entertainment, LLC.